Now we would like to start the Plenary Session 2, Behavioral Innovation for a Decarbonized Society. First, I would like to introduce the moderators for this session, Professor Kuroda Reiko and Professor Georg Erdmann. Professor Kuroda is an ICEF Steering Committee member, designated professor at the Frontier Research Institute at Chubu University, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Tokyo. Professor Erdmann is also an ICEF Steering Committee member, retired professor for energy systems at Berlin University of Technology, and president of the board at KSB Energie AG, Berlin. The speakers for this session are Mr. Rob Harrison, Director of Ethical Consumer Research Association, Mr. Matt O'Keefe, Head of O-Power at Oracle Utilities, Dr. Elisabetta Cornago, Research Fellow of Center for European Reform, Mr. Rakim Rakimov, Behavioral Research Associate of Center for Behavior and the Environment, RARE. And now I would like to ask Professor Kuroda to moderate this session. Professor Kuroda, if you please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, maybe good morning, or good evening for everyone wherever you are in the world. Thank you for attending a plenary session 2, Behavioral Innovation for Decarbonized Society. Individual behavior change of all stakeholders in society plays essential roles to achieve carbon neutrality. As an example, households consume 29% of global energy, and that means 21% of the result of CO2 production emissions, and one study implies that individual behavior change across various sectors such as agriculture, food, energy, and transportation could abate 20 to 37% of the projected total GHG, greenhouse gas emission, from 2020 to 2050. To make individual changes, we need to design how behavioral innovation could be triggered. This session will discuss the short term, that means up to 2030, and the long term, that is up to 2050, changes, pathways for individual behavior innovation. And also, what kind of public awareness is expected to acceptable such innovation, accelerate such innovation. Now, this is the first time the ICEF takes up this topic, behavior innovation. This is the 8th year for ICEF, and so far we discussed about more science and technological oriented sessions like hydrogens, or food, agriculture, or how to store CO2, all these things. So this is really remarkable, so I want to make it a landmark to start. We need awareness, we need technology innovation, but at the same time, we need behavioral innovation as well. So in the first half an hour, we are going to invite 4 speakers. They present their insights on behavioral innovations. After that, it will be followed by a discussion and question and answer sessions. So let's start the first presentation. Now, the first presenter will be Mr. Harrison from Ethical Consumer Research Association. Ethical Consumer Research Association Limited is a British not-for-profit publisher, research and campaign organization which publishes information on the social, ethical, and environmental behavior of companies and issues around trade justice, and ethical consumption. It was founded in 1989 by Rob Harrison and Jane Turner, and has been publishing the bi-monthly Ethical Consumer magazine since then. So we are very pleased to have one of the founder and the director of this association. So, Mr. Harrison, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name's Rob Harrison. I work for a UK-based organisation called Ethical Consumer. We work with consumers, NGOs and businesses to make the world a more sustainable place, which means we've been doing it for 30 years, which means that we know quite a lot about what makes consumers tick. So this session is called Behavioural Innovation for a Decarbonised Society, and my title is rather provocative. It says, no time left for behavioural innovation. And what I'm going to say is that while I quite like behavioural innovation, or nudge, as many people call it, but for climate change particularly, we need to be honest about the evidence that it can create change quickly enough at the necessary scale. So most people know that if you do consumer surveys asking people about interest in sustainable choices, majority of people show interest. This is one of my favorite ones from 2012. It says that I believe I have a responsibility to purchase products that are good for the environment and society. 82% of people in Brazil, India and China think yes to that, and considerably less in the UK, USA and Germany. However, you tend to find that majority interest of consumers across surveys, across time and across the world show this kind of interest in sustainable consumption. However, we know this slide says yet widespread adoption remains limited, yet sustainable lifestyles aren't practiced by lots of people where they could be. And we do research every year in the UK at the actual market size of sustainable product choices. We have 24 data sets at this time. They look at things like organic food, FSC and MSC certified products, which are mainly using nudge approaches to get people to buy more. This is one of the main reports from our research, and this shows the size of the UK market of sustainable choices growing to 45 billion here at the end of 2018, which is, it's a lot, but it's only 10% of all UK retail sales. 90% is not this stuff. And it's taken 20 years to get to this 10% or this 45 billion. So it's taken a long time. Growing ethical economies takes a long time. But we do need to make deep cuts quickly in our carbon impacts by 2030. This is a piece of research that we've done for UK consumer markets. And these are the kind of 15, 23%, 17%, 40% reductions are needed in some of these markets by 2030, we think. And the 10% that we've achieved in 20 years through nudge approaches isn't really looking good enough. So we need to understand why that is and see what it is that we need to do that will work. One of the ways that we understand how consumers behave is we group them into these three groups, where 5 to 10% always make ethical, sustainable choices, 20 to 30% hardly ever do, but the vast majority in the middle do it some of the time. And this is the really interesting group and the one that we need to look at now. So it's also interesting looking at this chart next to the Rogers innovation diffusion curve, because it looks quite similar, and we can see that ethical or sustainable product choices are a bit like ordinary innovations, and you have people who do them slowly, but the majority do it after a while in the middle. So how do we persuade people to do it? What are the key things that make this 60%, this majority of people, choose sustainable choices? And companies have learned over time that it's important to focus on price, quality, and convenience first. If your sustainable products are more expensive, less good, or less convenient, people just won't pick them up in large quantities. It's critical to mass market adoption. It's not possible to nudge consumers to spend more than a few % extra on sustainable choices. And as we can see from this chart here, the price of electric cars is considerably more. This is a map of Europe that shows the price of electric cars compared to ordinary cars. And you can see that it's 92% more in Belgium. The outlier here is Norway, where it's actually cheaper to get an electric car. And you wouldn't be surprised to see that where electric cars are cheaper, more people buy them. We can also see this same evidence from our own data sets in our annual ethical markets report. This is solar panels that you stick on your roofs, on your houses, that consumers can do for about the first 10 years. There was nothing much happening in solar panel spending. Then the government introduced a generous subsidy, £1.5 billion consumers spent in that next year on it. And although they reduced the subsidy later, and you can see the falls as the subsidies get reduced, it's a pretty much straight line between good pricing and mass market consumer adoption. The other thing that works at scale is choice editing, taking problem products off the market. And this is a map of all the countries of the world that have a full ban on the sale of incandescent light bulbs. So it's not rocket science. People know that this works. And these are the countries that have done it. So the reason that one of the reasons people like nudge or behavioral innovation is because it's politically attractive. And this is because subsidy is very expensive, choice editing can be really unpopular, and taxing problem products can be really controversial. These are the Gilets jaunes in France, protesting when petrol went up, amongst other things. So nudge is cheap and it's liberal. It's not bullying people into making the choices. But time is short and other methods look more likely to be effective at scale. The UN describes nudge as subtle, cost-effective and context-specific. And nudge is really useful where governments are opposed to climate action because consumers and companies can get on and nudge each other in the right direction. Where cultural issues prevent other types of intervention. Around meat, no one's going to be choice editing meat off everyone's menu anytime soon because of the cultural issues around what you eat. And nudge can also be useful when you're working alongside subsidized products. You can make electric cars cheaper, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone is going to buy them. So just to sum up what I've said, I like nudge a lot, but for climate change particularly, we need to be honest about the evidence that it can create change quickly enough at the necessary scale, because time is short, as Greta would tell us. More information about anything that I've talked about is available here at ethicalconsumer.org, and I also have a book out called Handbook of Ethical Purchasing, which looks at some of our consumer insights in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Yes, it was a very informative and very clear presentation. So he showed us from the consumer side that a nudge is useful as it's cost-effective and context-specific, but time is short. So there are many talks after this about nudge. So you really started a very good point shown us. So let us go to the next presenter. Mr. Harrison is talked about from the consumer side, but next one will be Mr. O'Keefe from Oracle. And he's going to talk about from the supplier side. Actually, it's on consumer side, but looking at from the supplier side of utilities. He's a head of O-Power, Oracle. And O-Power founded in 2007 and acquired by Oracle in 2016. And that provide a software as a service, customer engagement platform for utilities. So, Mr. O'Keefe, the floor is yours.
Hello, I am Matt O'Keefe, and I lead the O-Power business inside of Oracle. We work directly with utilities to tackle their most pressing problems that require engagement with their customers. I have the opportunity to spend my time meeting with leaders in utilities and government around the world, and the focus on reducing emissions has never been more clear. This is a map that shows all the world's coal plants that will still be operating in 2030. There's over 4,000 of them today, and they're emitting over 10 gigatons of carbon each year. The photos pinpoint some of the biggest plants on each continent, for instance, in South Africa or in China. And most will think that achieving decarbonization objectives is dependent upon replacing these smokestacks with renewables. And that's true. And some of the world's most dedicated individuals and institutions are working to make that happen. But think about the fact that even at a rapid clip, these supply-side investments will need time to play out, and we need to look at the demand side of the business for fast, affordable emissions reduction. When you look at the pathways to net zero utility emissions, like the goals set here in Japan by 2050, there are basically 4 pathways: clean energy supply, energy efficiency, demand flexibility, and beneficial electrification. The 3 grouped here on the right, these are on the customer side of the business, and getting the most out of them means getting your customers to take action on a pretty incredible scale. I want to highlight that these pathways, compared to clean energy supply, are big, fast, and affordable. And this is critical because global leaders are recognizing that we need to do all of this with equity and affordability as a foundational priority. The point here, and this is OPower's core thesis as a business, is that as you ramp up your focus on emissions target, you've also got to ramp up your focus on your investments in the customer side of the business. Now, well, OPower has long evangelized the important role customers play in decarbonization efforts. We wanted to see the data through an even more targeted lens. What's the aggregate impact of individual utility customer actions on decarbonization? So, earlier this year, we engaged the Barala Group to quantify the decarbonization impact customers can have by adopting new technologies and energy consumption behaviors in the next 10 to 20 years. The Barala Group, which is one of the world's most premier research firms that's focused on the energy industry and that works with over 50% of the Fortune 100, came up with a remarkable finding. By 2040, actions by utility customers can reduce nearly 2 times more GHG emissions than clean energy supply alone. That's remarkable. And if you focus on the right side of this chart, you'll notice how each of these technologies and solutions are going to rely upon a lot of individual choices to realize that need. These customers that we just spoke about are influenced to make decisions and take action by a variety of actors, from government, their community, and their own research. But when they think about decisions regarding their energy consumption, there's nowhere they look to more than their utility. The utility has such a unique role suited to drive customer action because customers go to them when they need to make a decision about a technology that impacts their energy usage. We must, in the utility sector, be ready with personalized insights delivered over a customer's preferred channel. And when we do that right, we establish a trusted relationship that results in value to both the utility and the customer. These are universal truths and necessary actions to drive customers' actions at scale. Well, utilities have this unique role in the market. They don't always have the best technology and solutions in-house to drive the scale of actions needed. And that is why utilities work with companies like us. They are seeking partners that can influence utility customer action at scale, leveraging the best available technology. This is not an easy task. It requires a combination of artificial intelligence and behavioral science. OPower employs a wide variety of these techniques to influence action, from simplifying the complexity through AI to using proven behavioral techniques to drive action. But here's what it looks like in practice. AEP, one of the largest utilities in the American East, recognizes that the customer experience is a strategic asset, and they leverage it with great success. They both wanted to and needed to increase self-service and get more people engaged online so that they could solidify their role as a trusted energy advisor. AEP uses OPower to do so, and in bringing together artificial intelligence and behavioral science into its customer experience, they've had some great results. Just to highlight the scale, last year alone, 20.9 million personalized touch points across web, email, direct mail, and text were shared with customers from AEP. And the vast majority of these communications are digital, which is great because that improves self-service and also deepens the opportunity for personalization. You know that customers want this because over 60% of them are engaging with the emails, and you know that they need this because the vast majority of folks are indicating this is improving their understanding of energy as well as their relationship with AEP. In addition, we all recognize that beneficial electrification is a great solution to the carbon problems we are addressing today. But across North America, utilities are struggling to quickly pivot toward electrification. So they work with trusted partners like Opower to start to move the needle. We've worked with one utility in Southern California to identify all of the customers that are using EVs and charging them at home. And while we believe there was 100% accuracy in this, the truth is really more complicated because only 97.1% of customers would admit that they actually had EVs in their homes. Interesting to think about what fact folks will actually report as being true or not. In addition, we do know that folks are looking for disaggregated information so folks have a better understanding of how electrification is impacting their bills. So we're disaggregating EV charging for another customer in the American West. Lastly, the intractable problem of transitioning fuels to get folks from heat oil and from gas to electric heat pumps. Customers in the Northeast have come to us, and we have put together personalized videos that let people know how much money they could save and explain exactly what a heat pump is. And these communications have drawn 10 times more visitors to the pages that explain the rebates and opportunities available for these heat pumps. We've got a lot of work to do to move this needle I just spoke of, but leading utilities are accelerating the path to beneficial electrification by making investments in these targeted tools. So, it's clear we can't decarbonize without the customer, and people are a tremendous untapped asset. But they also have a lot of choices to make, and the choice to purchase an EV and to buy that behind the meter solar and to purchase that heat pump to keep their homes warm are all going to be complex moments in their energy journey. So when it comes to reducing emissions in the energy sector, markets and regulations play an important role. But ultimately, you have to influence customer action at scale, and nobody is in a better position to do so than the utility. Thanks for taking some time with us today to think about how to leverage the role of the customer and the position utilities already play vis-a-vis that customer in order to meet a remarkable objective placed upon all of us to decarbonize our sectors. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Keefe. That's a wonderful presentation. Yes, you talked about from the supplier side of utilities to customers. What is really important point is we need customers change at scale, and also personalized information through AI or behavioral science. I mean, the key. If time allowed, I may go back to this AI and the behavioral science later, if time is allowed. Anyway, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Now, let's go to the third presenter. Next presenter will be Dr. Elisabetta Conago from Center for European Reform. The Center for European Reform is an award-winning independent think tank devoted to making the EU work better and strengthening its role in the world. Elisabetta Conago is a research fellow at the Center and works on EU energy and climate policy from economics point of view. Now, before joining the CER, Elisabetta worked as an environmental economist at the OECD. Now, Dr. Coronado, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation to the session on behavioral innovation for a decarbonized society. My name is Elisabetta Cornago from the Center for European Reform in Belgium, and I'm going to be talking about the role of behavioral insights or insights from behavioral sciences as part of a policy mix for behavior change and decarbonization. So our daily consumption patterns and consumption decisions have important energy implications. So from the use we make of our household appliances, washing machines, dishwashers, to the temperature at which we set the heating or the cooling, to the choices we make for our mobility needs, opting for the car and driving more or less quickly, or rather opting for cycling or public transportation. All of these impacts energy consumption as a whole, and residential and transport needs, as you can see in this chart, make up for an important slice of total energy consumption. Which is why we are here today, and we are here to discuss the role of individual and household behavior and investment decisions in achieving carbon neutrality. So of course, achieving carbon neutrality requires large-scale changes in how we consume and produce everything, but then what is the role of individuals and households? I think we can identify three, let's say, macro categories of consumption and investment decisions which are important for carbon neutrality. The first one is to unlock investment in more efficient housing and transport options. So through retrofitting existing older homes or building very efficient ones with new technologies, and electrifying transport, so shifting from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, for example. The second macro category of consumption decisions we can take as individuals that contribute to decarbonization is to make more efficient use of the resources we need in our everyday life, from electricity to water to fuel, again, if we opt for motor vehicles. And lastly, again, talking about transport, mobility decisions. So it's important to encourage individuals to shift away from fossil-based transport options and towards so-called soft mobility options, walking and cycling in urban areas, as well as public transport and road use. So how can behavioral insights inform policymaking for sustainable behavior change? And with sustainable behavior change, I sort of group together these three macro areas that I just discussed. I think we can think about this in three steps. First of all, insights from behavioral sciences can help policymakers identify what are the drivers of individual behavior. So in the specific case of individual behavior change for carbon neutrality, I think the question is, what are the various mechanisms, be they behavioral mechanisms, market mechanisms, or policy features that affect energy consumption and the decisions that drive it? The second step, or the second aspect in which insights from behavioral sciences can help policymakers in this area, is by identifying the barriers to sustainable behavior. So more specifically, what are the behavioral, market and policy barriers and misalignments which can prevent flexible and efficient energy use, which can hinder investment in energy efficient renovations, in renewable energy, or in the uptake of electric vehicles, and which can block the uptake of sustainable mobility options such as public transport and walking and cycling. All this information gathered from the identification of the drivers and barriers to sustainable behavior and investment decisions are necessary to have a full picture of how not only behavioral mechanisms but also market and policy context features are playing a role in enabling or hindering a shift to low carbon options, and they are necessary for policymakers to understand which are the correct policy solutions to put in place. And this is why I think a policy mix is needed. A policy mix that includes price signals, that includes regulation, and that includes also information provision and other behavioral interventions, or so-called nudges. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. So what are then the barriers and drivers of sustainable energy consumption and investment? They are complex, and I think we can again group them in various categories. On one hand, we have behavioral mechanisms. So the fact that our behavior, our daily life is based on well-established habits, oftentimes, which do so that we always choose the same transport option to go to work every day, for example, is one aspect that can hinder a shift to sustainable mobility options. Lack of awareness for sustainable alternatives is also something of a barrier, but also the pressure of social norms, time inconsistency that makes complicated opting for long-term solutions such as energy efficient retrofits. These are the behavioral mechanisms, but these are only a part of the story, because there are also policy misalignments that are hindering a shift to sustainable and low carbon behavioral decisions. We can think about unpriced environmental externalities, so the fact that carbon prices are to a large extent missing or too low to a large extent across the world. We can also think about the fact that energy taxes are still set at inconsistent levels with respect to long-term climate goals. But there are also persistent environmentally harmful incentives, such as tax credits for corporate cars and fossil fuel subsidies, which tilt the balance in favor of fossil-based transport, for example, as opposed to zero carbon mobility. And finally, there are also features of the market and more broadly of the context in which consumers take their everyday decisions, which can be difficult for them to read and understand in the context of decarbonization. For instance, energy price design can be complicated, and understanding energy bills and how to alter energy consumption at home for a more sustainable way of life can be difficult for consumers. Urban design and infrastructure is one of the contextual features that can make it difficult for consumers to bike, for example, or to take public transport, and so on and so forth. So what I'd like to highlight here is that behavioral insights can help address some of these barriers and drivers of sustainable behavior, but we cannot expect behavioral interventions or nudges only to solve all of these issues. And that is why, and this is my concluding slide, I think it's important to talk about a broad policy mix to support behavior change in order to address the complexity of the barriers to sustainable behavior that I have just discussed. So we need price signals to be right. So we need environmental taxation, including carbon taxes, carbon emissions trading, for example. We need consistent energy price design. We need to remove environmentally harmful subsidies. And we also need to get price signals right at urban level, including pollution pricing and congestion pricing. We need regulations also to encourage sustainable behavior and energy efficient investment through energy efficiency standards, for example, but also setting phase-out dates for fossil-based technologies, such as internal combustion engine cars. And again, regulation can also play a role at urban level. And finally, information provision and other behavioral interventions, such as nudges, can, of course, play a role in labeling, such as fuel efficiency labeling, in feedback provision mechanism, also with the help of energy utilities, with smart meters, home energy reports, and other creative solutions such as smart defaults for product specifications and standards. Insights from behavioral sciences can inform and should inform design of all of these policy efforts, but I think it's important to acknowledge that they are only one part of the story, and particularly with the need to accelerate climate action, we need to exploit the full policy mix. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cornego, for wonderful presentations. So policy mix is the key to support behavior change. Now we have to go to the fourth presenter, Mr. Rahim Rahimov. He is from Center for Behavior and Environment, called RARE. The RARE is the global leader in social change for the environment, helping thousands of people across hundreds of communities in over 60 countries shift their behaviors and practices to protect the nature that sustains their lives. And he is actually the young science. Now, this year, we started a new session of behavior change. However, one more thing we started this year is we asked the young people to give a talk in each session. And Mr. Rahim Rahimov, as you can see, he's very young. He got MA from University of Pennsylvania and first degree in St. Andrews. Now, I think rather than explain about him, but I'm sure he's happy to talk about his. So, Mr. Rahim Rahimov, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Rahim Rahimov, and I'm a Behavioral Research Associate at RARE Center for Behavior and the Environment. Today, I would like to make a case for leveraging a complete set of behavioral science tools to tackle climate change. At RARE, we believe that designing climate solutions through behavioral science lens can be an effective way of achieving environmental outcomes. But before I do that, let me quickly introduce RARE. RARE is the non-profit leader in behavioral science for conservation. We inspire change so people and nature thrive. At RARE, we believe that every environmental challenge, including climate change, has at least one thing in common. To solve them, someone, somewhere, has to change their behavior. While RARE is based in the US, our behavior change campaigns have focused on other parts of the world. To date, we've led more than 450 campaigns across 60 countries. What we found is that on average, RARE's campaign increased the adoption of sustainable behaviors by 18 percentage points. Compared to some other popular public health campaigns, that's doing pretty good. Along the way, we've also learned that how we go about influencing people and changing their behavior matters a lot. And this is what I will be sharing with you today. We know that people are complicated. When we make decisions, there are a lot of different things going on in our brains, and many different motivations are competing with each other. Sometimes we are weighing our options, calculating costs and benefits, and really taking our time to arrive at the decision. Other times, we react quickly, automatically, even subconsciously. And then other times, it's a combination of both. We often assume and like to think that our decisions are mostly made here at the slow and rational end of the spectrum. But in reality, most of our decisions happen on this side of the spectrum, fast and automatic. So when we look at interventions traditionally designed to shift climate behaviors, we often see change makers assume that slow and deliberate, calculated way of thinking. As the result, they over-rely on solutions that either change the rules, address the financial cost, or fill information gaps to get people to do things. Sometimes those things are necessary, but a lot of the times these strategies are not sufficient on their own. Incentives can backfire or send the wrong message, and rules can be very difficult to enforce. And I think it's fair to say that for many on this call, we are aware that information or raising awareness does not necessarily lead to action. As the result, at RARE, we believe that behavioral and social sciences can expand our behavior change toolkit by introducing complementary strategies. This expanded list of strategies recognizes that the context in which people make decisions matters a lot. We call this lever choice architecture, but you may know them as nudges. The next lever is emotional appeals. We need to recognize that while we often assume people engage in rational deliberation, emotional messages can be as powerful, if not more powerful drivers of behavior change than appealing to reason. And finally, social influences. Our decisions are highly dependent on those around us. People take lead from those that we like or admire, and this includes willingness to engage in climate behaviors. At RARE, we have a long checklist of tools and tactics and strategies that we use to drive behavior change for environmental outcomes. But for our talk today, I'd like to showcase just 3 successful applications of these behavioral levers to address climate-related issues around the world. 1. Making the desired climate-friendly behavior the default option has shown to be an effective way of achieving environmental outcomes. This is perhaps not surprising behavioral strategy, but nevertheless, it is still underused today. Here is an example of defaults at play. In a real-world experiment in Germany, when selecting energy contracts, half of the people had to actively opt into green energy, and others purchased it by default if they did not opt out. When researchers looked at people that purchased the contract, the number of those that purchased green energy in the default condition was 10 times higher than the people in the opt-in condition. It's really easy to see how the application of defaults can be extended to many other climate behaviors beyond just the energy sector. For example, when ordering food at a cafe, or defaulting people into reducing their carbon emissions through purchasing the offsets when buying a plane ticket. 2, we know that emotions are powerful drivers of behavior. So let's personalize our messages to make them more relatable and appealing. Our next case is in the UK. A study by World Resources Institute found that using alternative names to vegetable-based dishes that emphasize flavor and taste rather than absence of meat increased the sales by more than 75%. The lab has already partnered with over 200 cafeterias in the UK and the US across multiple cities and increased the sales of plant-based dishes by up to 70% across these sites. And finally, increased behavioral observability. Showing who has and has not engaged in the behavior can help us build the new norms about what the right behavior is and help shift people in that direction. Our final case is in the US, the state of California. In the field experiment, researchers from MIT varied whether the residents' neighbors could tell who signed up for a program designed to prevent electricity blackouts. The researchers had 2 experimental conditions. In one, the observable condition, residents had to sign up for this program via the publicly posted sign-up sheets using their names and apartment numbers. In the anonymous condition, the residents could sign up using only a unique code that could not be identified and did not reveal their identity. Participation more than tripled when people could join the program via the public sign-up sheet rather than anonymously. In addition, making this participation observable and using this behavioral strategy was 7 times more effective than offering $25, which was a material incentive used in the past. For a broad takeaway, I would like to leave you with this. We know that solutions to climate neutrality, such as electric vehicles, rooftop solar, or even plant-based diets, have been around for a while. The minuscule change in the adoption you see here are for the US only, and we know that the adoption varies by country. But we also know that behavior change as a strategy has been under-leveraged on a global scale. It is not that we haven't tried shifting these behaviors. It is that we need to start using a complete set of behavior change toolkits to complement our financial incentive, information, as well as policy and technological advancements. With that, I would like to thank you for your time and for inviting me and Rare to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Lakimov, for a really impressive presentation. 3 traditional pathways, 3 new pathways with each statistics and great examples. Thank you very much. Now we come to end of the first 4 presentations, and thank you for all excellent presentations. Now, from now, we're going to have a discussion and question and answers. Now we're having this session online, not face-to-face, because thanks to advancement of IoT, however, because this is due to COVID-19. Now, I want to ask all of you that one same question. That is something to do with COVID-19's effect. You know, we have witnessed the hesitance in partaking the sharing services, for example, the transportation. We may hesitate to do the reuse or recycle. And many countries, including Japan, are trying hard to reduce the use of plastic products. For example, the bags at the supermarket, now it's stopped. However, because of COVID-19, now incredible amount of non-woven masks, disposable gloves, vaccination syringes, incredible amount of new plastic waste. And so all these changes. Now, what do you think we have to do? You all talked about what has been successful, but we may be going to a different phase of society. So I want to ask all of you, but starting from Mr. Harrison, how do you think about this? With and post-corona, what's changed? What can we do to change the behavioral change to achieve carbon neutralization?
Okay, well, it's quite difficult to say because I think we probably aren't quite post-corona yet. We're still
with corona.
in lots of parts of the world, and so we're still kind of trying to understand how that is playing out. Certainly when you look at opinion, when you ask people about their behavior changes, we have seen, sorry, did I freeze there? I don't know. When you ask people about their behavior changes, particularly flying is quite interesting because people learned not to fly quite a lot during the pandemic. And certainly on the surveys, 30% of people say that they will fly less after the pandemic because they've realized that, the life is not so terrible if you don't have a plane every week, and this kind of stuff. So I think people have learned a little bit about how to live perhaps less materialistically, both across, travel and in other areas. And it's really interesting to see how we come out of that, because in the UK, I mean, we're still in the process of observing whether any of these intentions are going to turn out into real changes or whether they're not. But it's certainly optimistic, I think. And it's also been quite good on the level of people seeing that you can have quite dramatic changes in behavior. Can come quite quickly and the sky doesn't fall on your head. It's not, the behavior change itself isn't something to be frightened about. I think obviously the pandemic was, but actually changing, it isn't as maybe bad as people thought. So that's my contribution on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, you're the first one to answer for such a difficult questions. But let's go to Mr. O'Keefe from the utilities point of view.
Yeah, to build off, first of all, aloha from Hawaii. That is why I'm wearing this shirt today. I'm actually
Hawaii.
in the midst of a family vacation, but I'm glad to be here with you all. It's been a beautiful time here. I want to build a bit on what Rob just shared, because I look at it as a practitioner and expert on behavioral science as an incredibly inspiring moment to see how the intersection between policy change, which are the requirements and expectations that came from the government around COVID-19 and the way we change our lives, and how that interacts with the social proof of seeing people wearing masks and participating in new, more detailed sanitation procedures and then also talking about vaccination. And it shows actually how massively and how quickly we can change with this interaction between policy guidance and social proof. And so when I think about from the demand side and supply side, from the utility perspective, it makes me wonder if we should be more bold in our expectations and that we should actually have more opt-in programs that are directed from the regulators and the utilities with the proper amount of information alongside it to bring people along. So although there is very few silver linings in this incredible crisis we've faced as a globe, it certainly is an interesting thing for us to learn from as people who do engage with broad-based behavioral change and who need to see success from behavioral change in order to achieve our goals across the world. I will say, though, a big impact that we're seeing from utility customers is with the changes in the economy and not everyone having the luxury that we are on this call to be remotely engaging in our work and business. We are seeing a huge number of people that are dealing with deep economic uncertainty in this time. And I'm certainly concerned, as you alluded to earlier, that there will be people who can no longer afford to make those changes they are prepared to beforehand, or who are potentially reverting to habits that we have hoped to get past, like single-use plastics and the lack of recycling and whatnot. So definitely a big challenge, but I think that this combination of policy and social proof can actually move at a faster pace than we ever imagined.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it really shows the example we can change quickly at scale. We may learn something from that. Now we are going to ask Dr. Konago, what is it from the point of policy mix view? Dr. Konago?
It's a very interesting question, and perhaps we can point to a positive example of behavior change that has arisen with the COVID emergency, and that is the shift in many cities to cycling, for example, rather than using public transport, which has been considered as riskier by many users during the pandemic. So I think that successful and massive shift to cycling in a lot of European cities points to the fact that a small change in the choice architecture, as Rakim called it in his presentation, such as quickly drawing simple cycle lanes on the ground, simply with a line of paint, can actually unlock behavior change relatively quickly for users who might have been perhaps thinking about starting to cycle to work, but were hesitating because their habit, their routine was to just hop on the bus or on the subway or in their car. Now, I think that rapid response by local governments is a way to show how quick, in this case, simple infrastructural and policy decisions can actually facilitate behavior change at the right time, in the right place, rather than, on the other hand, perhaps nudging consumers towards opting for their car rather than public transport, which have had very different and negative impacts in terms of increasing their emission load. So that's a positive example, I think, of a policy intervention post-COVID.
Thank you very much. Yes, just a positive way of looking at things. Now, the final answer from Mr. Rakif Rahimov, please.
I think one of the Matt mentioned silver linings that came out of this devastating couple of years is that behavioral science, when applying multi-pronged, multifaceted solutions, can achieve real meaningful change. And what I mean by that, if we look at the countries that just used regulation, just used fines, or just banned people from leaving their homes, they really struggled to contain the virus. The people of those countries struggled. But when we look at these other solutions that met people where they are, physically in the locations where they are, or emotionally by appealing to their, for example, care for their community or care for their children, for their grandparents, they made the vaccination easy, they provided incentives, they did all of those, they checked all of those checkboxes. I think we learned that this is far more successful than just relying solely on just a few of the traditional approaches.
Thank you. Okay, now Perhaps it's a good time to ask Professor Dr. Erdmann to what's your comment on the 4 presentations and also first round session? We don't have enough time, but if you can make it within 3 minutes, I'm terribly sorry. So, George?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. We had a very interesting session with 4 wonderful speeches, but from the point of view of behavioral change, 3 of these speeches have not been very optimistic. Rob said that nudge is cheap and liberal, but not very effective. Mats is wonderful optimistic about the influence utilities could have on customers. But of course, this is not guaranteed. And I suppose with the growth of electric mobility, electrical vehicle, we will see a lot of problems between customers and electric utilities simply because the electric utilities are not able to provide electricity in sufficient quantities at sufficient speed to the owners of electrical vehicles. And then we have Elisabetta, who finally says that we cannot expect behavioral innovations that they solve everything. So that means very pessimistic. ICEF should never again organize a session on behavioral innovations. But fortunately, we have Raki. And he gave a very new view compared to all the other 3 speeches, because he says there is a complement to rational behavior, and we could use this complement in order to move behavior in the right direction. And I will give a very short example, which is somehow in the same direction, but which adds a new idea to this. And I refer to a case study in Belgium in the winter of 2014-15. Belgium is a small country in Europe which has very weak transmission lines to neighboring countries. And it has a lot of nuclear. And 3 of the 4 nuclear plants in that winter were not running. So the utility, the grid company assumed that there will be brownouts, announced blackouts to the customers. This they communicated to the customers, and they also said, if you make energy efficient, energy savings, we can maybe provide these brownouts, these blackouts. And then we at the Berlin University, we had access to the data, and we analyzed them and found out that without behavioral change of the Belgian customers, there had been a lot of brownouts in that winter. But there were no brownouts at all, simply because the people had been aware that they should really do something in order to prevent non-availability of electricity. And this energy savings did not occur because of communication of this abstract idea of climate change, etc., but very concrete. They will suffer not having electricity in winter. And in addition, there is an altruistic element. If I have no electricity, I cannot save electricity. It has no impact. But if I have electricity, I save my electricity consumption, reduce my electricity consumption, I create a benefit to the other people of Belgium. That is altruistic elements. So my conclusion is, maybe we should not focus exclusively on climate change, which is to most people too abstract to see really that they should do something, but to do something in order to, you can do because it helps you for your day-to-day life and helps you to do today or tomorrow and not in 10 or 15 years. And I think this is somehow in the line with Rakim's idea. So this is my comment. I hope I did not talk long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, about your comment. Now, yes, time is getting a bit limited, but I want to go to the second round questions. And rather than go into the details of nudge and the new pathways, I think the importance of involving young generation to this behavior change now we heard from Mr. Rachmov, it's really complete set. And that was very impressive, but I'm sure there are several other, many examples for this. So for same question to all presenters, and how do you think of the involvement of young generation? How do you want to approach to younger generations to achieve carbon neutrality? So maybe, sorry, it's always a start from Mr. Harrison. Is that okay to ask you?
I think you should address that question to the youngest member of the panel first.
Okay, the first I will ask,
Maybe
and to come back to you.
Page order this time, yeah.
I'll give you some time to think it over. So, Rahim Rahmo, yes, you had plenty of things to say about the involvement of young generation.
Sure,
Please.
absolutely.
Yeah, the floor is yours.
I think from the perspective of the US, we know that the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, they are far more politically and climate engaged than the older generation. And I think one of the reasons that is the case is because they are the ones that will be bearing the direct impact of climate change in the US. Mm-hmm. And that is one way to appeal to them, is just tell them that you will be impacted by that. But from a behavioral science perspective, we know that hyperbolic discounting gets really, really strong, and it just stops people in their tracks when you talk about the impacts that are distant, that are 10, 15, 20 years from now that they may not feel right now. So I think one way to get access to the younger generation is to appeal to things that are important to them right now, recruit the messengers that are important and respected by this generation. That might be, for example, Greta, but for other segments of the population, that might be someone else. So picking the right messenger and appealing to the concerns that are immediate and near, I think are going to be quite effective.
Thank you. I don't think they need the awareness raised, but towards the action. So, Mr. O'Keefe, are you ready to answer? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Question. Yes, thank you. Ultimately, we're making decisions right now about building infrastructure, transmission and distribution infrastructure, and investing in renewable or fossil fuel electric generation. And the next generations will pay for this. And so I think that it's incredibly important that we're engaging with the next generation of folks to decide and engage and push for a different way that we assess these costs and benefits associated with these investments. But a big way that we can prove out that we can go even farther than the models show or engage in the most optimistic levels the models show is to recognize that people's habits will have to change dramatically, and they're willing to make those changes so that we can actually deal with the integration of renewables onto the grid and intermittency associated with renewable energies. And so I think that when we think about a household decision around when you're using energy and what time of day, we can have price signals, and those are strong. We can also have the social signals that we've had for years around recycling or time of day mobile phone usage that has oftentimes been fully understood by younger generations, even when they're not paying the bills. We can do the same thing with the utility sector and tying and understanding of the emissions coming from their energy usage decisions during the day. So I think we need to have high expectations, because time and time again, millennials and Gen Z have really shown a willingness to make those connections and to change behaviors in ways that their parents and the older generations may not have embraced en masse.
Thank you, Mr. Kufe. And then I may go to Dr. Konago. How about the policy mix? It's different for young generations and senior, or what do you want to talk to them?
Yeah, so certainly, I guess different segments of the population have different carbon footprints and consumption patterns. Yeah. So Of course, we need to understand also what is the potential for emission reduction and for behavior change in each of these groups. So I think, as the respondents before me have said, we have seen in recent years through the climate strikes very clear proof that the younger generation has perhaps higher awareness of the implications and risks of climate change. So I'm not worried about that, but I think what policy action is to do rather is to provide the right incentives to all social groups, and particularly to those groups which take the decisions in terms of, are we going to renovate the home to make it more efficient? Are we going to buy a new, more efficient appliance? Are we going to buy an electric vehicle or stop driving and opt for public transport? So those are the decisions that need to be affected, and those are then the social groups that need to be affected. And I'm not sure that it's the younger generation that is going to take those decisions. So there needs to be a broader perspective and policy approach to that.
Yes, I think it's the discussion, including the young generation, is very important to talk about climate change and the behavioral change as well. Anyway, now it's the time for you. Is it Harrison? Are you ready to talk something, or you rather go?
Oh, that's great. Everyone gave a sensible answers, and that I wouldn't disagree with. I would say that just two things. One is the role of formal education. So over the last 30, when I went to school, no one knew about climate change, so we didn't learn about it, and so people of my age, don't necessarily have that as part of their formal education. And I think we have seen, particularly over the last 10, 15 years, it becoming part of the curriculum that everyone has to learn when they go to school and actually understand the science and the way that it's all linked together. And this has a really important, it's no accident that, it's partly the younger generation is going to carry the burden of climate change, which is driving it. I think that we also need to recognise that formal education will have played a role in making this happen, and so we need that's another area to focus on, to make sure that is right, because there are still parts of the world where it's not happening, and it's just really crazy that this is not happening at the time now. So I would focus on that. I'd say that I can bring that to the story. I mean, it's interesting that certainly in the surveys that we have, particularly behaviours around food, much more veganism, vegetarianism in the younger generation, which I think potentially these long life-formed habits are easier to change when you're younger. You haven't got the same patterns of behaviours that are really hard to break. So some of those clearly work better, and there's a lot of change in that behaviour in the younger group that we can't see elsewhere. So across the complexity of it, there are real opportunities there.
Yeah.
And I guess the final thing is how do you engage the younger generation? Is you listen to what they have to say, and full marks for having a diverse panel in the age front here, because that's kind of what's happening.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Harrison. Yes, education is important, but the people these days can get information through internet, and the quality sometimes may be good or bad. There are many things to discuss about it, but time is getting really short. So we have to have a very quick comment from Professor Erdmann about the second round. Then I'm going to the question from audience. So, George, the floor is yours.
Yes,
Sorry, it's very quick.
Thank you very much. I would just add an information. In Germany, we had 10 days ago national elections. And there had been those young people which voted for the first time for these national elections. And what was very astonishing, 25% of this group voted for the Green. But another 25% voted for the Liberals, that is a right-wing liberal party in Germany, which is very astonishing. And of course, if you look at public media, etc., you think all young people are green. But in Germany, it was obviously not the case. My analysis is this has to do with the COVID politics. The COVID politics was very good for old people and very bad for young people. And the young people reacted in saying, okay, we vote for other parties which had not been in charge with these politics. This is my comment.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, let's go to the questions from audience. First one is to Dr. Konago. Okay. Do you have an idea to make people change about their consciousness of the daily life for decarbonized society? Do you have an idea to make people change about their consciousness?
Yeah, very interesting question.
Okay, good.
So I think something important we know from behavioral sciences is that to engage with people and to help them at the right moment, we need to provide timely information, and we need to help them think about, in this case, the footprint, the carbon footprint, the environmental impact of their consumption decisions right when they make them. So one idea, for example, would be to add information on here is the carbon footprint of your grocery shopping at the bottom of the bill you pay at the cashier. Likewise, and we had examples from O-Power in Matt's presentation, adding information on here is how your energy consumption compares to your peers, and here is how energy intensive your energy consumption was this month. That's another element to help connect the climate change issue. It can be abstract to your very specific energy consumption. And thirdly, from the mobility perspective, I think it can be helpful when you buy a train ticket or a bus ticket to write on that, here is the carbon footprint of this means of transportation with respect to the others. And likewise, I think at the gasoline pump, when filling up, here is, what is the environmental impact of your full tank at this stage. And here is how, for example, driving slower can help reduce that impact. So timely reminders and timely information provision at the point when consumers are engaging is critical, I think, to help them link their daily acts with their environmental impact and improve their awareness.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the second one. This is sort of a general question. Many say the behavioral change of a single person can't make any impact to the global climate crisis, as you all talked about it. How can we change their minds? Anyone who wants to talk about it? We all talked about it. We need a change at scale, you said.
Yeah.
So, okay,
jump
Mr.
in.
O'Keefe? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This is what my organization does and how we built a business, because you actually have no other option but to change individuals' behavior in order to achieve what you need to do. And one person's momentous change is not that meaningful when you have a whole bunch of people doing nothing. But on scale, micro changes, small changes are incredibly powerful. And so that's why when we think about finding those trusted sources of information, like you shared earlier about having some concerns around, those trusted sources of information, those few that do exist still, can move people forward 2, 3, 5, 10% towards objectives that we have, and en masse, that is remarkable. Ultimately, we have worked with millions of consumers, and the amount of energy they save each year, making small changes, is equivalent to shutting off an entire American state's power supply for the full year. We're talking about over 30 terawatt hours of energy savings. So it is absolutely possible, and I would actually argue we cannot achieve anything without those small changes on an individual level. So I want to make sure you don't feel alone, and so we got to communicate with folks that they are making change, but so are others. So it is not actually futile. It's very much worthwhile.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you talked in your presentation, personalized information through AI or behavioral science from the trusted body. That's what you want to say. Now, just give a quick, next one is no time for that. Okay. Unfortunately, time is going to run out, and I really don't have time to wrap up this session. So what I really said, we have really many things to discuss more about this, but it's the first trial we worked on this behavioral session, and nudging or behavioral change at scale, consumer side, utilities, supplier side, policy mix, and from the complete set, a new approach. So they are all very, very impressive. And I think we have many messages to take home. So now I'm Unfortunately, we have to close the session. So I thank all the presenters and all the people who participated, and particularly for those who actually asked questions. Thank you very much for attending this session. Bye-bye.